right, everyone. Welcome to the Heal with Kat podcast. I have my guest, Dr. Robert Hurst, on the podcast today to talk about life's fingerprints, aka birth order, which is a very fascinating topic. So, welcome to the Heal with Kat podcast.
Thank you, Kat. Happy to be here.
We are going to have a lot to talk about. We were just talking about this before we pressed record. I'm the oldest of five. My dad is the youngest of five. My fiance is the youngest of four. My mom is an only child. So there's so much here that I'm like psychologically ready to get into. But as I was reading your book, Life's Fingerprints, which is amazing, and I recommend everybody go and pick it up wherever you are in your family system. You talk about your history being an orthodontist, and then you got into this work. So I would love if you took us through your journey of how you got into this.
Well, sure. It's a long journey, but when I started my professional career as an orthodontist, I realized I needed to get the cooperation of teenagers. Now, that in itself is a hurdle. And when I reached my private practice and I started seeing patients, I realized I only had a few minutes to make this decision as to find out what kind of cooperation I was going to get from my patient. So I had to find a tool that could give me this information. But let me back up a little bit and say that I looked at a number of tools, and then I looked at birth order. But the start of birth order really started around, well, it started a long time ago, but it really was noticed around the turn of the century by a fellow by the name of Alfred Adler. And he was a contemporary of Freud's, which was kind of interesting. They were in the same psychological society together. And Freud had the idea that really children, their makeup was really related to their parents. It was all about the parents. And Adler said, I don't think so. I think it was more of their interactions with their siblings that made them who they were. Well, this didn't work very well because the two were not meant to stay together, because Adler was a number two child. He had an older brother. And Freud was the oldest in his father's second family. So there was a little rivalry between number one and number two. And then they parted ways, never to speak again. And this was around 1890, 1900. And Adler went on to develop the idea of family constellations. Now, you've heard that word before, because I've done a little research on my own and looked up Bert Hellinger, who is kind of the father of your movement, and he talks about family constellations. Well, I think they're using the term interchangeably. Adler was looking at it with the idea of all the kids in the family. That's the constellation. And of course, Bert's looking at it a little differently too, but it's the same idea. It's a whole group of ideas and people and emotions, and that's how it all goes together. So that was the beginning of it. So I took this birth order theory, and in the simplest ways, he talks about the oldest, the middle, and the youngest. But that doesn't work at all. That's way too simple. But at any rate, I started using it, and I found that in my practice, only about a third of the patients fell into these categories of number one and number two and number three. It was not working. And I was about ready to throw the whole idea out. And I said, I'm going to go look at the family constellation of all the kids in the family and the years between the kids, because I would see many children in the same family. It would go on for years. And I realized that 2/3 of all of my patients were separated from brothers and sisters by at least 4 years. And that's when I came up with the idea of double birth orders. You see, when you're separated by 4 or 5 years, the older child is off at school and the younger child is home with the parent, and they're getting the nurturing that an only child would get. So they get all the characteristics of the only child added to their birth order number. So that's where double birth orders come from. And when I did that, all of a sudden, everything worked. Everything worked. And so it was like a realization that the birth order really does work. But a lot of people get disappointed in it because they make it too simple. If you look at the books that are out there, they talk about the oldest and the middle child and the youngest. That doesn't work at all because a lot of them could be double birth orders, and that changes everything. So that's how I kind of got started with it.
So you're saying that as the oldest child, I had like 3.5 years where I was the only child, which means that my double birth order would be the oldest and the only child.
No, because you don't have enough separation in years.
Oh,
You
okay.
need at least 4 years in school because that makes you go out of the house while your sibling is still in the house. As long as it's less than that 4 school year period, you don't have these double birth orders.
Okay, so what evidence is there for the birth order, and why is it not the complete explanation of human behavior?
Yes, there are more things that go into finding out who you really are than just your number of birth. And that's when we talk about what is your real birth order. Okay, because just because you're number one or number three or number four or two or whatever the number is, that doesn't tell you enough because you have to find out in your family constellation, in that dynamics of the family, what you really were. In other words, the first thing you might want to look at is we talked about separation in years between the children. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's one, the spacing. Then we might have to talk about step brothers and sisters who might also be living in the house or not living in the house. And then we have to look at who did you really live with when you were growing up? Sometimes children are taken away from that structure in the family and they live with a grandparent. That changes their birth order. And then we have to look at handicapped siblings in the family. And something as simple as ADHD is a bit of a handicap, and that changes the family dynamics. And then were there multiple births in the family? Were there a set of twins somewhere along the way? Because twins take a lot of energy from the family, especially if they came after the firstborn. If you were the firstborn and then the next birth were twins, you would feel very disadvantaged because everything's about the twins. So in the book, as you mentioned, we look at how to find your real birth order. What are you really functioning at? Are you really a number one, or are these other factors in there? And also, there's cultural factors too. You know, if you live down in the South and the second birth is a boy and he's named Hunter, that's going to change everything in the family. You might be dethroned without doing anything, and you feel really bad about it. So we have to look at these other factors to find out what your real birth order is, and then we'll go from there about the characteristics.
Well, that brings up something really interesting because in my dad's family, there were five, but one was born with some birth defects and he died when he was 9. You call that a phantom child, right? But we in family constellation therapy, we'll call it like an early death. And so really, when you look at my dad's siblings, the technically oldest that's alive is my aunt, and she really does act like the oldest. And then everyone kind of falls in line after that. And so I've always wondered, what if he was still alive? How would those family dynamics change, and how did they affect each person in the family system?
Oh, that's an easy question to answer.
Oh,
First
tell
of
me.
all, first of all, what number was that child that died in the family? Remember you told, okay,
First
it was
one.
number one. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. What happens is when any child dies older than you move up in birth order. So number two had to move up into number one's position. There's still a number two with all the qualities with number two, but they have to function within the family like a number one. And it can be more difficult. That also happens if there's dethroning, sibling rivalry, where number two knocks off number one goes down to number two. Well, then number two realizes, wait a minute, I have to act like number one. I got to be in charge now. I didn't sign up for this. So what happens? The phantom child, what you're talking about, since a child lived to be about 9, is really not the phantom child. The 9-year-old child really did exist within the family, and everybody interacted for those 9 years. When that child died, everybody moved up. Number 2 became number 1, number 3 became number 2, and so on. The phantom child is one that might die at birth or a few months later than birth, and the parents keep that child alive by having birthdays on their date of birth. And what's hard about that is the number two birth can never compete with number one because number one is perfect.
Mm.
It cannot compete with them. As hard as they try, every year that birthday comes around. Now, Vincent van Gogh is the example I use in the book. Vincent van Gogh had a brother named Vincent van Gogh, 1 year older than him, who died. And his mother continued to celebrate the first Vincent van Gogh's birthday. And Vincent van Gogh did not handle it very well. As we know, he cut off his ear. He had psychological problems. So that's the phantom child that can really mess up all the other kids in the family. But what you're talking about is a real child that really did exist. And then everybody knew that child. But then after that child dies, everybody moves up, takes a role that they have to take.
Fascinating. And, it makes me think of the psychological effects of what that does to somebody, when you have to move a role like that. Like you said, it could be quite jarring
Oh,
or
boy.
shocking. Like it feels like it might have permanent lifelong effects to the psyche as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I talk about birth order is that unseen force. It's kind of like radio waves. We know they're out there, or television, you can tune them in. But what we're doing, understanding birth order, is you're going to start to tune in all that energy that's flowing out there constantly. And this is what helps make all your decisions. You don't realize while you found a number 4 boyfriend, okay? And I just told you in a few minutes exactly why you found him, because you have a number 4 in your family.
And he's a boy.
And all these decisions that are made are it's not that they were destined to be made. You're making them because of your interactions with all your siblings and who you really are. And everybody's unique. And if you can just tune into this, boy, does it make your life easy, because it's predictable.
Yeah. Well, it's measurable. And I think in a world where sometimes healing or self-development, or even, when we're dealing with the psyche, a lot of things can feel kind of confusing or hazy. We're kind of working through a lot of feelings. So that's what I really like about your book, is that it gives people an idea of understanding a deeper sense of who they might be and how they've developed as a result of their family system. I have an archetype quiz for my community called the Cycle Breaker Archetype Quiz.
Right.
And like the birth order, it's not a complete explanation of who you are, but there are parts of you that exist as a result of childhood family dynamics. And I was trying to piece together, okay, is the oldest child always the caregiver? Is the middle child always the rebel? Is the second child, or maybe the first child, or an only child, are they the parentified child? Like, I was kind of going through my quiz trying to put them all together.
Well, I can try to answer that for you,
Oh, sure.
because well, first of all, you have to find the real birth order.
Right.
Okay. Once we find the real birth order. Okay. So number 1 is I want to be in charge. So number 1 is the caregiver. There's no question about that. But who's the rebel? Well, the rebel is number 2. Don't tell me what to do. They want to control their own space. Now, number 3 is the child that's really connected to the parents, because the parents think of them as, they're kind of like the baby, but they're very sensitive. We call them laughing on the outside, crying on the inside. They try not to let anybody know how sensitive they really are. They're the sensitive child.
Yeah.
And of course, number 4 is the comedian in the family, because that's the baby. That's the real baby. Everyone takes care of the baby. No one listens to the baby, so they have to, talk really loud and get your attention and whatever. But the hyper independent would be the only child, because the only child is given all this support from the parents, and they have no competition. So they have a lot of self-esteem. And of course, like everything has 2 sides. There's a plus and a minus. Okay. Well, for an only child, let's talk about the 2 sides. One is the hyper responsible little adult, and the other is the terribly spoiled child that gets everything they want. You remember the movie Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Well,
Yeah.
Charlie was a very responsible little only. All the others were onlys, but they were all spoiled.
Yeah.
They all just wanted this. I want this. I want this. Okay. So they're the really the hyper independent. I talked to a fellow the other day, and he says, I'm unemployable. I said, well, what do you mean you're unemployable? He says, I'm an only child. And every job I've ever had, I go in there and I tell them I know more than they know. So it's just a matter of time before they fire me because I'm unemployable. I know too much. But that's the independence of the only child. You know, they see no boundaries. They have great self-confidence. And if you add that only as a double birth order to one of those numbers, you add those characteristics. So it really changes them a lot.
Oh,
Makes
it
them
just
much
goes to
more
prove.
powerful.
Yeah, it just goes to prove how dynamic we are as humans. I mean, there's so many parts to who we are.
Oh
You
boy.
started you started to touch a little bit on the traditional birth orders, and I would love if you could take us through those, plus any strengths or challenges of each birth order for people listening. Hey everyone, it's Kat popping in during the episode today to tell you about my free cycle breaker quiz. Do you ever feel like you're the black sheep of your family, or maybe you find yourself stuck in the same family patterns or dynamics over and over again with no relief? Well, what if I told you you could transform that role into something really, really powerful? When you take my cycle breaker quiz, I help you understand the childhood coping tools that are showing up in your adult life today. And by understanding how you show up with your family and the role you play, this can be the portal into understanding the patterns of your lineage. Ready to embrace your role? Go to catdow.com/cyclebreaker to take the quiz or visit the link in the show notes below. Your transformation from black sheep to cycle breaker starts right now.
Okay, let's start with the only child. Okay, now the only child's characteristics that we just talked about, there's two sides. They can be like a little adult, and that's the one that in school, all the other kids say, will you go talk to the teacher? Because the teacher is in their peer group. That's an adult, that's a different generation. Okay, and doesn't bother them because that's what they're used to. And, they're the ones who get elected school president because they're more adult-like. Okay, and their first friend is a book because they have no brothers and sisters, and they're very good in school naturally. It goes through that. Now in life, if they've been given everything, life gets to be tough because life isn't that way. You have to work for things. So depending on how they were raised within the family, but what happens to them is later in life, they have to take care of their parents because they are the only child. So they have to take care of their elderly parents. So the parents took care of them. They have to take care of the parents later on in life. Now, the only child becomes a number one when the next child is born. They're not really happy about that because they've been getting everything. And now all of a sudden, they have to share. Sharing was not their deal before. Okay. But it takes a little bit of while, and then they realize, this is a lot of fun. I can tell this number two what to do.
Oh man.
Okay. So all of a sudden I can do, and I'm going to follow the rules. I'm going to take the parents' rules and I'm going to enforce those rules. I'm the enforcer. I am in charge around here. And they love to give the orders, but they're also, very responsible. And, they're, whatever the parents' views are, they take those parents' views. Now, number two comes into the world. He doesn't like to be told what to do, especially if he looks at his older sister. Okay. But the number two, he wants to control his own space. Number one wants to tell others what to do. Number two says, I'm not going to tell other people what to do. I just want control over my little kingdom, who I am. And so they can usually have a better outgoing personality. They can be a better athlete because they have to be something that number one wasn't. Number one is the good one in school, so they got to be different. So they become the athlete. And if number one is kind of shy and introverted, number two becomes more extroverted. Okay. And they're very competitive. And of course, they can be the rebel. Now, there's the dynamics between one and two. Two wants to knock off number one. Number one wants to hold the position. And that goes on all your life. It does. Now, a little competition is good because it makes you stronger. But if anybody should lose if number one should lose and get dethroned, and number two becomes, the king or the queen, that changes everything for your life. And if you've been dethroned, you can just drop out. Now,
Mm.
sometimes number one wants to hold a position so well that they become both the athlete and the student. And now number two has nothing to be special about. So number two can drop out even without confronting number one, because number one just squashed number two. And if there's a number three can move up to number two's position. So there is dynamics that goes on. But let's talk about number three. Number three is the sensitive, intuitive child. Okay. And they are that way as an adult. They're very open to everything. They're non-judgmental. And so with that, they have to be careful of drugs and alcohol because they're open to experimentation and they can get trapped because they're so giving and they're quiet about it. And before you know it, they might have a problem, but they don't want to tell anybody what the problem is. So they're going to be very quiet about things. You really have to draw them out. But they're highly sensitive, and I find in orthodontics they're very sensitive to the pressures we put on their teeth, more so than the others. So we have to be very careful, and you have to be very delicate. If you want to reprimand a number three, it's not like reprimanding a number one or number two. You have to be gentle about it because they really feel it. They're great in groups because, after all, they lived in a group. I say in the book, I explain that when they're born, they have to understand 17 different combinations between number one and number two, number one and their mother and the father and whatever. And so immediately they're great at interpersonal relationships. So, they're very good at that. They tend to be, they can be very religious, good in religion. They can be in the arts. They can be musicians. They can be artists. Sitting there with a sketch pad, that could be number three. They want to save the world. They want to save the environment. Now, if you add the only to that number three, you get powerful people. Okay. So, you got to find out really what you're dealing with. Regular number three is just fine, but add that only to it, you get a drama queen. You get Shirley Temple. She was a three only. Wow. And she was called Little Miss One Take. Why? Because she was like a little adult, but she had the cuteness of the number three, this little sweetheart, America's sweetheart. The problem was she couldn't parlay that into an adult career because once she turned to a teenager, she was no longer that cute little girl that acted like an adult. And so her career was over, at least in show business. She did other things, but there's an example of the three only child. That really takes it to the limit. Now, let's go with number four. Number four is the true baby in the family. Number four is not afraid of adults because he was raised by older kids. So he likes that. But, he can be the comedian in the family. He doesn't take anything very seriously. He can be schooled by his older siblings. He's the kid in my office that drops the appointment card on the way out of the door. But, someone else is going to pick it up for him. But, they're a lot of fun to be around. And they can be really good athletes. They like to play. Now, number two also is an athlete. But number four is really athletics is where they can really shine. Michael Jordan, the basketball player, he was a number four. And, he was great at that. He wasn't so great at business. Okay, that wasn't his expertise. But playing basketball was. So, that's kind of the stories of the birth orders. Now, when you get to number five, it starts all over again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I was talking one time at a Catholic school, and I was explaining all the birth orders, and everybody was, and I could see that there were questions in the audience. And someone raised up their hand. They said, Dr. Hurst, do you know where you are? And I said, well, I'm the Catholic school. And he said, we're Catholics. We don't stop at four.
It's my family.
And I said, okay, well, let's talk about the next group. Okay. It starts all over again. 5 is like a 1, 6 is like a 2, 7 is like a 3, and 8 is like a 4. But the difference is it's like primary colors and secondary colors. The primary colors are the 1, 2, 3, 4. The secondary colors are 5, 6, 7, 8. They're the same but muted. If number 1 is really bossy, telling everyone what to do, number 5 tries to do the same thing but is a little nicer about it. Okay? If number 2 doesn't want to be told what to do, number 6 is a little, not quite as appearing so stubborn. So it's the same but not quite. And in fact, if you talk about who should get along with who, if you have these large families, number 1 should relate really well to number 5 because you're kind of the same. And number 2 should relate well to number 6 and 3 to number 7, something like that. So that's how it goes with the larger families. Now, talking about larger families, we're going to talk about another type of double birth order, which maybe some of the people in the audience have. If you get a space of 4 or 5 years between groups of kids, you get another type of double birth order. There's only 2 types. The one that has the only child with them, but the other one is where they have another number. Let me give you an example. Princess Di had a double birth order. She had 2 older siblings, 2 girls that were older siblings. Then there was a 5-year gap and she was born. So she was born a number 3. And we know about all her work she did as number 3. She was a school teacher. She cared about landmines and in war-torn countries and whatever. But a couple years after she was born, she had a brother who was a number 4. So now she becomes the oldest in this second family. So she is a 1 and a 3. So her 1 was, she was trying to make her way in the royal family. She was trying to be number 1, and she was having a hard time. And of course, who was she married to? She was married to a number 1. He was the oldest, you see. Yeah. But he was just the oldest, and he wasn't a double birth order. But she was 2 people. She would go from being a 1 to being a 3. And the world kind of saw that. So I use that example because people can relate to that. They remember Princess Di. And of course, her brother was a 2-4. And he was very vocal about after she died, he blamed it on the royal family. And he just, spewed whatever hate he had for them. But that's the other type of double birth order. Now, I'll bring it up to modern day times. Let's talk about our president. And birth order is non-political. First of all, there are no bad birth orders. And birth order doesn't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican or a conservative or a liberal. It doesn't care. It's how you were raised and how you feel about things. But Donald Trump is a double birth order. He had the first 2 in the family was a boy and a girl, close together. Then there was a 4 or 5 year gap, and he had a sister. And she was a 3, but then there were 5 more years before Donald was born. So her birth order was a 3 only double birth order.
Wow.
Then Trump was born as number 4. But a year or 2 later, he had a brother. So he becomes number 4, but he's the oldest in actually the 3rd family. So he's a 1 and a 4. And that's why no one can understand him, because he acts like a number 4. He's a comedian. He talks whatever's on his mind, it comes right off his mind. And they say, how can he be so unpresidential? He's a 4. He can't help it. He just says whatever's on his mind. But he wants to be in charge and make decisions and take care of people like a number 1. So there are the two birth orders within the same guy, and that's why no one can understand him. And that's why he's the art of the deal, because no one, they say they can't trust him. No, they don't trust who they're talking to. One day they're talking to a 4, and he's throwing the guy out of the White House, number 4. And then he's a number 1 saying, well, you want to sign the deal? The deal is good for America. So that's why he wrote The Art of the Deal. He didn't realize, he doesn't know who he is, but he's a double birth order, and that's what drives everybody crazy. If they would just read the book, they'd understand, but they don't read the book. So that's a type of double birth. And would you believe it? He had the same birth order as Walt Disney.
Really?
Walt Disney had the exact same birth order as Donald Trump. They were a 1-4. And think about it. What's Donald Trump into? He was into casinos and golf courses and whatever. And Disney, he was into theme parks and whatever. And, and so, but they both wanted to be in charge. And I'd heard that Walt Disney never allowed anyone to take any credit for any good that ever happened within Disney. He wanted all the credit himself. And what do you think Trump does? He wants all the credit himself. So people look at him and say, you're narcissistic. Of course he is. That's okay. That's who he is. So when you start to look at birth order, everything is explained. And it's the Rosetta Stone of understanding everything around you. So when I just use those examples that just everyone knows about, it says, oh my God, I better get the book.
It is so fascinating. Like, as you were going through each traditional birth order, there's some things about the first child I totally resonated with. And then there's other things that I didn't resonate with the exact example you gave, but the belief behind it. So, for example, I was never good in school, but when it comes to emotional things, I am an overachiever. In my work, in my job, when I'm passionate, like I overachieve. I work a lot, like I want to follow the rules, I want to do the right thing. So, like, it may not always, what I'm taking away from this is it may not always be the exact same thing, but the intention behind what's been being done feels very synonymous for me in terms of like the first child.
Yes, it's a group of ideas and a group of personality characteristics. I'll just give an example. Since you are one, I'll give you an example of a one. Hillary Clinton would be the example of the number one that's pretty bossy, tells people what to do. Now, she had to do that because she had two younger brothers who wanted to knock her off the throne. So she had to, present herself as strong. But Julia Childs was also a number one. And what did Julia Childs do? She cooked for us. Okay, she was the great chef, but she was doing the same thing that Hillary was doing. She was controlling the people around her by doing good things. How could you be mean to me? I'm doing all this for you. Okay? So they're doing the same thing. They're going at the same thing a little differently, but the same result.
Very much,
So
yeah.
that's what you're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, when I was flipping through the book and reading it, you brought up Scott Peterson, which was really interesting because you were naming all like Walt Disney and all these like positive facing people, but then you showed Scott Peterson, this notorious murderer of his wife and unborn child, and you talked about his placement in the family system. And I thought psychologically that was very interesting as well.
Yes, and he was a 7.
Oh my goodness.
Okay.
Hey everyone, it's Kat popping in during the episode today to tell you about my free cycle breaker quiz. Do you ever feel like you're the black sheep of your family, or maybe you find yourself stuck in the same family patterns or dynamics over and over again with no relief? Well, what if I told you you could transform that role into something really, really powerful? When you take my cycle breaker quiz, I help you understand the childhood coping tools that are showing up in your adult life today. And by understanding how you show up with your family and the role you play, this can be the portal into understanding the patterns of your lineage. Ready to embrace your role? Go to catdow.com/cyclebreaker to take the quiz or visit the link in the show notes below. Your transformation from black sheep to cycle breaker starts right now.
And I believe he was a 7 only, which makes
yes,
it
you did.
3 only double birth order. Very, very strong, very sensitive. And we know 3s are very manipulative. In the number 3 in the family, they manipulate number 1 and number 2 because they know they're going to be fighting. And so they manipulate them to fight. And then they say, oh, it wasn't me. I had nothing to do with it. Well, it had everything to do with it. But they're very good at understanding people's emotions. And he was very good at that. If you go back into his story, he's coming up again for another court hearing or something. But, he had another girlfriend at the same time and all these things. And, he's going to manipulate things. And he did. And now it was one of these blended families. And he, I believe, was born after the parents of the two blended families got together. That's how he came up number 7.
Okay.
So he was their real child, but he had brothers, stepbrothers and sisters. But he was functioning as a seven only in that situation. So you have to look at the whole picture. And I know what you do with family constellations is you're looking at what happened to these other members in the family in past generations. The fellow that started Bert, I did a little research on him because I figured we need to know about him. What do you think his birth order was?
Oh gosh. I'm gonna,
Think about everything we've talked about.
yeah, I'm gonna guess he's maybe a three.
Well, there were only two in the family.
Oh, okay. So he was
He,
the oldest then.
no, he was number two.
Oh.
He had an older brother that was killed in the war. They
Oh,
were both in the war. They were, of course, they were on the German side,
yeah.
and his brother was killed, and he survived the war, and he had well, this guy Bert had, oh my gosh, from being a priest to being living with Aborigines to, my gosh, his
Here's a life story.
but that's number two. Number two doesn't want to be told what to do. And he was doing all these different things. And he was busy all the time, busy, 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 doing stuff. And putting all this together, that's how he came up with his idea, because he had so many different experiences in life. He kind of melded them all together. But he was influenced by the death of his older brother, and you hit it. You said he's number one. He had to act like number one because
Yeah.
he moved up to that position after his brother was killed. But he was still a number two. So
Mhm.
there you go. There's birth order explaining how all this is working. It's
Oh, this is
amazing.
the ultimate party hack. Everyone needs to study this and then go to a party and ask people, what are you in your birth
Right.
order? And you will understand people so clearly. Wow.
And that's
This
why
is
I say the
amazing.
book is the hardcover book. You only can get it through the website. And it's easy to get, remember, because it's called mybirthorder.com. And if you do it, I'll autograph it for you. If you tell me something about your family, I'll write something in there about it too, to find your real birth order.
Yeah, you
But
did that with me, Miss Perfectionist. I was like, oh my God, how did he know
but
that?
what's nice about it, it's got the hardcovers and it has color photos and everything, and it's great for the coffee table, especially for Thanksgiving, dinner, and Christmas. Everyone can look themselves up. The other one, the first edition was a paperback, and it's on Amazon, but it's not in color, and it doesn't have a section in the back which is questions and answers that I was given at lectures I've given. I put questions and answers in the back, a lot of things that people would want to know about. So that's what's so different about the hardcover book. It's well worth the difference in the price. And you can get it cheaper off Amazon, but it's not the same thing.
Oh no, this is a very special book and it's got a lot of good information in it. And it's something you can just open up randomly and like flip to a random page and read about.
Right.
But you talk about sibling rivalry in your book, and it makes me think about this quote that I've heard a lot in family constellation dynamics, that sibling rivalry is not really about the siblings, it's about parental favoritism. Do you resonate with that? And also, does that influence the dynamics between siblings? Because I can say in my family, it definitely did.
Oh, yes. I try not to put the parents' influence too much into birth order. It is for the only child. It's 100%.
Yeah.
But remember, that only child became a number one only after the birth of number two. So there's still some lingering parental influence. Now, we use the example of baby birds in the nest. They all want that worm when the mom or dad comes to feed them. So they're all out there saying, hey, me first, me first, me first. And that's true about kids too. They want to get the parents' attention. But number one was an only, and they were already getting the attention. And that's why a lot of resources go to number one. And there's a lot of things about number one that's special. First of all, take a look in the phone book. Do you see look under churches? Do you see First Baptist Church, First Methodist Church? You don't see second or third. They're always first. Everything's always first. Okay, so I use the example of a cereal, Fiber One.
Yeah.
Okay, Fiber One cereal. They don't call it Fiber Two, but it's Fiber One. So ones have a little bit of advantage already. When you go to an athletic event And I'll show you a prop here. Remember these props? You know,
Yep.
we're number one. Okay.
Yep.
Number two, they try harder. I think that was that Hertz's motto, or Avis. We're number two. We try harder. Number one is number Hertz, something like that.
Yeah.
So number one has a little edge. And so the interrelationship between the kids, that's why number two wants number one position. They see you're getting some goodies there that they're not getting. So they want to
Mhm.
make some attention. And so that's why, the sibling rivalry, look in the Bible, Cain and Abel. Well, they were vying for God's attention. And it didn't work out very well. I mean, that was taking it to the extreme because one thought God loved him better than the other, and they wanted, to get rid of the competition. So some of that's pretty natural. All right. Now, when I use the birth order thing, when number one has a number two it's born, they're very sad at first. But then when number three is born, they get very happy because now there's two kids that they can tell what to do. Number two doesn't answer very well, but number three, they'll listen to him. And then number four, oh boy, I can do that. Okay. So, oh, you're smiling, I can tell, because
Oh,
that's what happened to you.
Dr. Hurst, my parents used to go to dinner and we would have a babysitter come and I would boss the babysitter around and I would put on these plays. And then my parents would come home. I mean, my family still talks about this and they would say, we thought Catherine was going to be an actress or a director because she would put these plays together and she would order us to sit down and she would push everybody around and she would say, you're missing your line and you need to. And I just had a crazy imagination and the babysitter would be like, who's in charge here? And you don't know my siblings. So it was this like really insane. I'm like resonating with this right now and like trying not to be embarrassed about it, but it is what it is.
Well, when I do these podcasts and I talk to people who can talk back at the same time, all I hear is, oh my God, oh my God, that's me, that's me, that's it, that's it. I understand it now, especially when I explain who you are and who the people are in your life, and I've never met them. And I'm telling you who they are. They said there must be something to it, and there is. But you have to find the real birth order. In your family, it was pretty simple because you were one, two, three, four. But it's not that simple. And let's talk a little bit about blended families. Now, this is going to fall into your constellation situation because what happens in a blended family is they go together. This is what was the famous blended family? The Brady Bunch.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is everybody's birth order can change. If your birth order moves up or stays the same, you do great in this new blended family. There's no problems at all. If you get demoted, you never adjust to the new blended family. You are a problem. You are a behavior problem in school. Everything's wrong. And so and even if you're close in age, all it takes is 1 week older and you have that higher birth order. So two girls are 13 years old, but one is 13 and 1 month. She becomes number one, and number one now becomes number two, and number two doesn't like it because they used to be number one. And you know what it's like to be number one. I'll give you an example. In my practice, not a big town, so I see kids from all different families. And in one particular family, it was an only child. She was a great little girl. Her mom decided she was going to remarry. And so she remarried somebody who I was also treating his two daughters in my practice. So I knew all the kids, I knew all the players. And the little only child said to her mom, I really like our house. Don't sell our house yet. And she was really excited about getting a dad. She'd really never known a dad. And so she moved in to the new dad's house. And now what did she get? Well, she got two older sisters.
Mm-hmm.
But she got a dad. But she had to share the bedroom with her two older sisters.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't, but within 6 months, they were divorced. And they were divorced because the only child has a lot of power. And she said to her mom, we're going back to our house. I want my own room. She got demoted from being a only child to being a number three. In school, her grades started to slip. In the office, she started breaking her braces, her teeth weren't clean, everything was wrong. Her whole life changed. At first, it was great, but then when she realized she was no longer the only child and getting all that, you know, attention, she was number three with two older sisters and she had to share. It didn't work out for her at all.
Mhm.
And that's what can happen with these blended families. She was a blend, they unblended. but
How do
these
you
blend,
navigate that? How do you like help blend the families then?
well, you have to realize what's going on. And sometimes it's better that the child that got demoted might go back with the other parent in a different situation where they might keep their birth order. I mean, it's very easy to figure it out because you have the ages. And you can say, okay, now the two girls that were both 13, now if you go back with mom's family or dad's family, you'll be a number one again, even though you got a step or half brother, but you'll be number one. So you keep your number.
Well, I guess my last question to you is what is your birth order?
Well, I am a number two.
Okay.
I have an older sister who tried to tell me what to do.
Whoops, we're us older sisters, huh?
Yeah, I, I may have dethroned her, but at this point in my life, she now has Alzheimer's, and
Mhm.
I'm taking care of her.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, so I'm sure she doesn't like that idea, but she doesn't know. But
Oh,
I've come to her aid, even as mean as she was to me as my older sister.
yeah.
Uh, she's still my sister, and I have to take care of her. And so that's what birth order is all about. You have to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And so I've
Oh,
moved up to number one. You see?
which
Yes,
Oh my
exactly.
gosh. Oh, well, this was such an informative episode. And I know that so many people are going to walk away just understanding themselves a little bit more. And I still think it's the ultimate party hack. It could even be a cool tool with like hiring people, like getting to understand your employees. Like,
Oh, geez, yes.
oh man, you could,
That's all part of it. It's every part of your life is influence. And I'd be happy to come back and talk to your group, especially if you have a question and answer session
yeah.
sometime in the future. Be happy to do it.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Hurst. How can people connect with you? You mentioned how people can buy your book, but if they wanted to work with you or interact with you or engage with you more, how can they do that?
Well, they can, through the website, you'll see actually, we have two websites. One is lifesfingerprint.com, and the other is mybirthorder.com, and they interact with each other. And you can send me messages, and I'll try to help you and, interact with your constellation therapy. If I can help and make your life less stressful, that's what it's all about.
Oh, you're
More
so
smiles, less frowns.
Oh, oh, you're so sweet. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. Everyone, go connect with Dr. Hurst. Thank you again for your time, and we'll see you next week on the Heal with Kat podcast.
Thank you, Kat.